Hello, everyone. I'm Julie Kurtz. I'm the CEO and the founder for the Center for Optimal Brain Integration. And one of the things we value is elevating voice and casting a spotlight on the work that people do around the country. And today we have Dr. Shelley with us, who's going to share a little bit about the amazing work that she does.
Well, thank you, Julie, and I welcome everyone who's listening. I am Dr. Shelley, but what I do is I work virtually, and I have been working 20 years virtually with families across the U.S. and internationally. I work with when a family has a child that has received an autism or an ASD, autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. I will work with the parents virtually, and I was one of the first ones to use, believe it or not, video before people had cell phones. And so parents send me a certain amount of video. We work from the video. And I have to say, I've been doing this now for 30 years, but the results, the outcomes, when we work virtually have been spectacular and beyond what we could accomplish in 1 hour a week by my showing up at someone's home. But I also should mention to you that I also have been a parent of a child who came into the world 2 months early, and we were told he would not survive the night. And I was told in my lifetime that I would never walk again 4 times. So I'm not really good at, I hear a diagnosis, I approach it, in a way that seems reasonable, but I don't believe in a self-fulfilling prophecy. Clearly, I'm walking and happily walking. And our son, when the doctors had nothing else for him, I said, well, fine, then just get out of my way. And there's a story to that. And he did survive, and he thrived. And for a year, he was being seen by an incredible developmental team. Every month, they'd tell me what to do, and I'd go home and I'd do it. And at 12 months, they told me he was a gem. Take him home, enjoy it. That was the words. And 1 month later, he disappeared. So I went back to that team that had known him for a full year every month. And of course, they thought I was a nervous mother. And within 5 minutes, their faces fell. And they evaluated him and realized, I thought it was a medication reaction because he was still on medication from being so little. And he was given a diagnosis of severe autism. Severe at the time, the term was mental retardation. Today we say intellectual disability. I was told he would never form words and that he would never know me again. And in that moment, believe it or not, the next day we moved to a state where we had no friends and no family. Well, needless to say, I had to figure out what to do. And so I had been a pre-K through 12 educator and teacher trainer. And I was at that time beginning my doctorate in health psychology. So I took everything that I knew about health psychology and applied it to my little guy. And I was very fortunate. I was able to connect with some incredible researchers who hadn't really gotten their work out yet, but they were willing to share it with me. The only way they'd share it, though, was not just for my own child. I had to learn their research for all children. And then I invited volunteers and I invited professionals to join me. And we ran a program for him for, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 4.5 years. And when he was 8 years old, he was completely declassified. He no longer had an autism diagnosis. He turned out to be extremely smart. And this idea that he wasn't going to talk to me, I'd go to him to understand crypto and NFTs because he knows it, I don't. We have a deal. I'm allowed to talk about him until he was 8 years old, and then he's entitled to his privacy. He does let me share one thing because of that severe mental retardation diagnosis. He graduated his university in the top 1% of the university. Imagine if I had bought into that original diagnosis. And believe me, he was severely autistic. He was, no question about it. And so as we were figuring out and following his lead and figuring out how to take him to the next step, as he began to, we didn't know what to expect, but as he began to improve by leaps and bounds, all of the therapists that had come to learn from me now were asking me, would you work with families we're working with? So for about 10 years, that's what I did. And then I decided to write a roadmap book. And it was a time before self-publishing, and making a long story short, I was told that that year there were 451 new books published by MDs. And they all said that autism was irreversible and incurable. We don't use that word. So basically I was told I would be a publishing risk, an insurance risk. So I thought, well, if you have to be a doctor for people to be able to accept what you've learned and what you've seen, I've been working with families beside my own for 10 years, and their children were doing fabulously. So I decided, okay, then I need to become a doctor so that I have the voice that parents need. And then I spent, aside from my private practice, I spent 12 years becoming a doctor. And I did that so that families could then work with me in developmental and relationship-based therapies, which is where we really, really see the difference and the best outcomes. And then in the process, I became a researcher as well. And I decided to go back after about 20 years. I went back and interviewed all of the people that I'd worked with. So the families, the siblings, if they were old enough, the family members extended. We interviewed therapists and volunteers and autism interventionists all around each individual child. And although the research tells us, relatively recent research tells us that, that 10% of children with autism can have what they call an optimal outcome, which means the child loses all trace of their autism diagnosis. In my mixed methods health evaluation of my program, which means we did qualitative statistical analysis, and then we did quantitative analysis by analyzing interviews. What we found is that we had 70% of the children had achieved optimal outcomes. So that was pretty exciting. But we also found, especially since all of us know the statistics, is that if a family came to us with the couple married, there were no divorces, none. In fact, during the interviews, you heard the mother and father, who I was interviewing separately, talk with such glowing terms about their spouse. Whoops. And as well, aside from how beautifully each of the spouses separately spoke about the other. And by the way, the real importance, if the dad is there, of what the dad could do to even, and we had families where both parents were working. And I would want to mention that for my own child's program, yes, we spent 12 hours a day and we had a team of volunteers, but I've never asked that of any family I've ever worked with. They actually determine what makes sense for their family system and for their child. So that's not a hard and fast, I was just telling you what we did. And of course, that was the first one. That was the first program that we've done. The other thing that came out in the research that I would love to highlight is how beautifully the siblings did, because this is a key area of importance, and I was able to help the families to really focus on making time for that sibling that was special, and each one of them was just a unique person. So I asked the parent why they thought, and they said, well, my first child is the child in this case that you were helping me with, but I'd never been a parent before. And you were essentially teaching me a more positive way of parenting my child with autism. And I just went along with it for the other child, and that child just blossomed. So there were wonderful information in the research, and that gave me the sense that we could go further. And what I did for a short period of time was open a nonprofit, and it was called parentsaspartners.com. And the intention of the nonprofit was to offer parents 45 free classes with downloads and materials, and I developed 45 classes. But in the end result, it cost a fortune, and we were unable to get full funding. So what we've done is we've left up 2 key modules of that. And that's what I wanted to tell you about next, because the first one tells you more about my own story and you get to know me a little better. But the second module, module 2, talks about a key piece of what parents get when they work with me, and that is a focus on their mindset. And we work very specifically on that, because you can only be your most creative, your most loving, your most joyful when you're fully there in that moment. So one of the things that parents have allowed me to do is to help them if they're having difficulties, especially difficulties around what they're doing for their child, to kind of clear that up in our time together so that they're able to be very, very present for their own child. And that course, what we did was we developed a course that can be completely downloaded, and it's got podcasts and it's got all kinds of written materials that you can freely download. So that still sits on the internet. My husband and I keep that going. And when we didn't have the funding, I went back to doing private consulting with families. So I do consulting now and work with families and their child. And we look at the family system to make sure that everything's working well. We do it on Zoom, so that one parent can be one place and one can be another place, and the child is well taken care of, so that we don't have to worry that we have to do a diaper change or any of the other things that you might have to do with a child for that hour. And what we've seen is that when I can help the parent realize that they really are their own child's best expert. No one knows your child the way you do, and no one's going to ask you the questions that you can answer, except maybe me. So when we can get parents to the place where they can be their child's best expert, they can offer their own love, loving attitude, leave judgment outside the door, then that's where the change happens. And the thing to realize, I think, is that autism, when you come right down to it, is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's not really about what you see outwardly. What you see outwardly, let's say when a child is flapping, right, is that child doing the best he can to stay calm anxiety. I mean, it's scary as heck to be in a world that you can't take in. So, and how do we know this? Well, 30 years of working this way has shown us that when we meet the child where they are and we recognize that what we see outwardly is simply a symptom of what's happening inside the child. And so what we do is we resolve the underlying issues that each individual child, I call it their individual autism profile, because every child with autism is different. And you might have a child with an autism diagnosis, but quite frankly, when I meet them, I realize maybe you could call them autistic-like, but in actuality, when you give them what their body and their developmental system needs, there isn't any autism. It might have been sensory processing disorder. It might have been trauma. There can be any number of reasons. In fact, I'd love to show you I have a presentation here that, let me share my screen.
That'd be great. Share your screen. And I think this is, while you're pulling it up.
It's not working.
Yeah, while you're pulling it up, I'm just going to really highlight a couple of things you said. Individualizing the strategies, and parents are the experts, and meeting the child where they're at just is an incredible thing you just highlighted. Are you able to share your screen?
No, the share isn't coming up. Let me just pause. So if we think of the behaviors, and I'm sure you may have seen this before, if you think of the behaviors as what you see of an iceberg, right? It's pretty impressive, right? But the reality is that what's underlying, what's under the water is really most of what's going on with the iceberg. You're just seeing a little bit of it sticking out. So if we think in those terms, if we think about the same ideas, so the iceberg then is similar to our outwardly observable behaviors, right? But what's underneath and causing it, the big mass of what's causing it, and this is not in any way a complete list, are the ability to self-regulate, environmental factors. You can see sensory processing dysfunction, motor planning, perceptual vision, developmental and emotional capacity. I mean, it's a wide range. That's why it took me 12 years to become a doctor. And when we look at a child through this lens, and we begin to add interventions that resolve whatever we're seeing in your individual child, right? That child becomes ready for moving forward with development. So this is probably the best one to show you. Amount of the iceberg that we see typically over on the left, and then under it, you can see how much more of an iceberg there really is. And that's really the same thing. If we look at the same picture on the right side, we can consider what's above the waterline as the outwardly observable behaviors, things we see, but of course you can't see under the water mostly. And then below the waterline, these are all, many of, not all, the underlying conditions that can affect any individual child. And by asking the right questions and observing the child and helping the parents to understand what they're seeing, right? We are able to work on these underlying issues, resolve them so that this child's development, remember it's a developmental disorder, can move further. And it doesn't matter the age of the child. I work with young children who are recently diagnosed or, slightly after that. But whatever age the child is, if we approach the underlying issues, that child's development can go further. And Julie, if you would scroll down a little further, there's a tree. Okay, oh, a little too far. Okay. Oh, well, let's look at Jean Eyre's pyramid of sensory integration. And the reason I wanted to show you this, because every child with autism has sensory integration issues. It hasn't yet hit the DSM-5, but all of us who work with them know that this is very much at the root of why children with autism can't seem to take their world in. And each of them has a different pattern. But if you look at the bottom two rows, basically the foundation of the pyramid, these are the 7 senses, not the 5 we learned when we were in school. And in fact, today there's an 8th sense that we talk about. And there isn't time for us to go into this right now, but I am developing a course for epidemicanswers.org. And when that course is posted, which should be in the next month, many of these handouts will be available to download from my website, drshelleystratus.com, all right? And what I wanted you to see was, if you look further up the pyramid, right, look at where auditory language skills are. You've got to have all of these blocks down here working in a developmentally appropriate manner. In other words, if a child is 2 years old, they have to have a reasonable range of development of a 2-year-old. If a child is 6 years old and isn't quite where a 2 or 3-year-old is, we've got to make sure we go back in and put these in so that these can support, look what's here, cognition and intellect. So it's not that my son didn't have the ability to be intelligent. He didn't have any of these pieces because basically he hadn't been cooked. And so when these pieces came online, he could start developing to the point where he could do his own activities of daily living. He could regulate his behavior, and he obviously was ready for academic learning. But look where auditory language skills are. Everyone wants to know, when will my child talk? Well, when we get all of these working, unless there's something going on in the mouth that needs, other intervention, language starts to come, all right? And at the same time, we also look at the child developmentally, and I'm not sure that you'll be able to see it largely enough here, but this is Dr. Stanley Greenspan's developmental milestones. And a child, thank you, a child must be able to share engagement with you, share attention with you, and be available to engagement before they can develop further. So when we sit a child in the chair and we just keep asking them to say what we say, it doesn't necessarily have meaning if they're not really sharing attention and engaged with you, right? And then we go up the ladder of his developmental milestones. And typically this is a newborn. This is a newborn. Intentional two-way communication, usually easily before 18 months. It might not be verbal, but that child is pointing and giving you ideas of what they want, right? And so we go, and again, this is something that will be available on my website for you within a month. But I wanted you to see here, at the root, what's most important comes from sensory integration is regulation. And if there's one thing that's most important for parents to realize, it's that in order to be able to shift where a child is, where a child's emotional modulation is, where a child's sensory modulation is, that child must be calm and organized. So we start from regulation, because if you want the tree to grow and you want the child to be able to go through the developmental milestones up to logical thinking and communication, which is about where a 5-year-old is and ready for kindergarten, right? We've got to get these root issues handled, the underlying issues. And the first thing we do for parents who want to know is regulation. What works well to calm and organize your child? And quite often you get that information by speaking to your sensory integration trained occupational therapist, and they will give you something that's very individual for your child. It's called a sensory diet. And for some children, regulation happens because we put them in some cushions or a beanbag and we turn them into a sandwich, give them some heavy pressure. For other children, believe it or not, a piece of gum in the mouth really, really helps. There's a wide range of things, and we have to look at what your child needs to regulate. And what do we need to do before we co-regulate the child? We have to be regulated. We have to be sure that we are calm and organized and ready to love our child. Even if the child seems to be going, off the deep end with a tantrum or running, the first step always has to be helping that child to co-regulate, because children, very young children or children who are developmentally young, don't have the capacity yet to regulate themselves. So this is really where it begins. And then when we get all the underlying issues, the roots handled, children are ready to begin and how do they develop? Through joyful, loving play. There's no right thing to do, but let me give you an example of something that happened with my own child. I'm allowed, he was under 8. I was told, if he's not interested in anything else, pick 3 of his favorite things, put them down, see which one he goes to, then think of 3 things you can do with those things. That's it. Well, I put 3 things down, and one of them was my son's transitional object, we'll call it. It was his, raggy green sweater, is what he called it. And it was on the floor, and he picked it up. And when he put it down again, I picked it up and started to laugh. And this child, who had no eye contact, looked up at me. Love that. So then I put it on my head. And now he was only 2.5. So he stood up and reached for it. And of course, I gave it to him. And once he had it, he gave it back to me because he really liked the game. And I stuck it under my shirt. I didn't have to do a lot of planning for this. All right. And he loved the game. And in our first time of doing that together, We were running around the room. We were hiding it together. We were playing joyously. And meanwhile, he was motor planning and figuring out a space and relating to me, showing me intentional two-way communication, problem solving. He was already 4 levels up from where he had been when we walked in the room, just because we were playing together. And then you can't stop them. Once they start developing, as long as you follow the child's lead, let the child be the director, then they will show you where they have to go. And if you bring in, let's say, you're excited, you're bringing in the game Candyland. Every child loves Candyland, but what your child is interested in is the box. That's what you bring it. He's the director, and you can do wonderful things.
Wow.
Eventually, you'll have interest in the game itself. And quite often, kids make up their own rules before they want to work with what the manufacturer wants you to do, but they can be really creative.
So you're saying really find that child's interest, what sparks joy for them, play with them around that. And as they begin to learn through the play, you can also begin to find pathways to regulation. And once you learn individually how that child regulates their body, whether it be through a piece of gum or in a beanbag chair or deep pressure, olfactory, then they'll be more prepped to begin to learn as their bodies, their sensory systems, central nervous system starts to calm.
Right.
That's incredible. Wow, Dr. Stravitz, this is so powerful. For people who are listening who want to know, one, how to reach you, I'm clearly going to put a list of your websites, your links in our accessible YouTube video, and I'll reach out to you to get that all written up. But I also want them to know, are there any top tips you could give somebody? Like if they leave listening to this, one thing they can try. I took away, like play, find their joy, find what interests them. What else might you add to close?
Well, I would go with the idea with the green sweater. Take your child's 3 favorite things, make them available on the floor, right? See where your child goes. Which one is he or she most interested in, right? And then in that moment, you don't have to have a whole long plan. You just have to take a moment and then come up with something silly to do with it, right? It's wonderful to do big facial expressions. It's wonderful to change, change your voice. Oh, I've got it, sound effects, right? All of these will bring your child's attention to you. Now, if the child shows no interest, the other thing I would suggest is we never push, right? So this is something that comes out of the wonderful Sunrise program, which is a developmental and relationship-based program. And that would be join your child.
Joy.
What your child is doing is helping them to calm their system so that maybe they can take you in. So if that child, whatever that child is doing, do it with him. And, I have a wonderful story about my own son. When he was older and we were able to have complete conversations, we asked him, what would you suggest to a parent who has a child, who began as he did? And he said, I'm paraphrasing, but I have it on tape. He said, join your child, enter their world, play with them in their world, because then at some point they'll be willing to play in your world. And
wow.
Every time I tell it, I get the chills again.
Well, I think I've gotten the chills 10 times listening to you. I'm so grateful that you would take time to help the world see the important work that you do. I think there are so many families out there that will be listening that want to contact you. Let me ask you one more question. Do you work with all ages, parents?
I tend to work with young children. They don't have to be 2 or 3, but they're definitely under 8 years old.
Under 8 years old. Okay, so really in the early childhood community. So absolutely. I just want to thank you and see if there's any last thing you want to close with.
Well, I would say probably the thing that we say all the time, which is, and probably sounds crazy to someone who hasn't worked with me and doesn't, because we have such joy when we work together. I would say, have fun, right? Because that's where your child's going to grow, not in your stress, right? Not in your, and by the way, you're not, yes, you are your child's first teacher. That's a given. But when we play in this way, there's nothing you have to teach them. Nothing. Give him the opportunities. Give her the baton. Let her direct you. You'll be the assistant director, and you will begin to see. You can tell that I'm in the Hollywood area. You will begin to see that your child is beginning to show you change, right? You don't have to fix them. Love them. Accept them for who they are in the moment. I accepted my child. I accepted what they told me, but I didn't believe that that was his future. So whoever he is in the moment, that's who I'm going to love.
There must be no greater gift that we can give our child to love them just the way they are and give them that felt sense. And then through joy and play, helping them climb the ladder and polish their highest self, their highest capabilities.
That's not to say that things may not in the play, may not work out the way they want.
Yep.
Things may not, right? But there's so much learning in that. And more importantly, you're there, you or whoever else is playing with your child, you are there. So your child knows I have someone, I have a relationship with this person, I'm safe, I can trust, and together we'll figure out a different way to do it.
Wow, what an incredibly powerful way with the highest level of wisdom to end this interview. Dr. Stravitz, we are going to make accessible every link you possibly have with all of your resources. I want to thank you for your time today and for making such a difference in the world and giving so many children a voice. Thank you.
My pleasure.